Hi everybody, greetings from Anchorage, Alaska. My name is Kyle Hopkins. I'm a reporter and a special projects editor here at the Anchorage Daily News. The story that we wanted to talk to you about today is one that was reported relatively quickly over a few weeks as we had time, but was one that we've been thinking about for a very long time, and that is an issue of policing in Alaska's most remote and vulnerable villages. And by vulnerable, I mean that they have the highest rates of domestic violence, the highest rates of suicide and sexual assault. And these are places that cannot be reached by roads. They only can be reached by an airplane, sometimes a boat. And policing them is difficult and expensive. For the most part, some of these communities, as many as 75 communities across Alaska, have no police at all. And in cases where they do have police, what's happening is you have a local government with almost no tax base that is tasked with hiring its own village police officers. And as you can imagine, without being able to pay a lot and without a big base of people to draw from, we're talking communities of 500, 600, 700 people. Some of the people that they're hiring to be police probably should not be wearing a badge. We would notice that these village police officers would sometimes be charged with crimes. And as we would write the one-off story about those crimes, we would look at the history of the officer and find that that person was already convicted of crimes. Sometimes they were on domestic violence, the subject of domestic violence restraining orders. Sometimes they were on active probation. The story that we published recently identified an active police officer who was also a registered sex offender, meaning that when you looked him up on the sex offender registry, there his employer was listed as the city of Napaskiak. So to tell this story, we looked at a case of a village police officer or a patrolman who had been charged with rape and providing alcohol to a young woman who died in his village, this community called Selawik, which is above the Arctic Circle. It's just in the middle of hundreds of miles of tundra. The city had been hiring village police officers, but they've been hiring people who were sex offenders or who had felony criminal convictions, or in the case of this officer who we wrote about, he was a bootlegger. He had been importing alcohol into this village where there was, like many Alaska villages, there's a prohibition on alcohol. In this case, the cop not only had these previous convictions, but he was awaiting trial on a recent case of getting another girl drunk, a 13-year-old girl drunk, and sexually assaulting her. So he was allowed to stay on the job as a cop despite having this criminal record that under state hiring regulations would preclude him from being a police officer. But he also was not fired when he was arrested and charged with new felonies, including being accused of doing exactly what he did when this girl was killed. But the thing that really kind of triggered a wider policy story was when we called the state regulatory board, the one that oversees cops and revokes certification for bad cops, and asked, well, how many of these village police officers are there in Alaska? Why is it they don't seem to be vetted for prior criminal records? The response from the state was, look, we have no idea. The state doesn't know how many village police officers there are in Alaska. One of the challenges in this reporting was, in many cases, the local governments didn't want to tell us who their police officers were. We could send blanket or kind of just a raft of records requests out to 200 plus villages, but it really helped to have an idea of which communities were actually employed VPOs or village police officers, and which ones might have problem officers. And what we found was that while the state regulatory board didn't know which communities had VPOs or village police officers, there was another arm of state government called the Division of Community and Regional Affairs. And that arm of state government asks each city government to send in a list of city employees whenever there's a new election. And so what we found was that by going to that branch of government, they did have a list of VPOs. Not in every case, but at least that gave us a place to start, whereas suddenly I went from having almost no names of cops in rural Alaska to having a few dozen names. We did a records request for every letter that the Police Standards Council had sent to a community in Alaska saying that an officer that they were employing was ineligible. And in that case, we were then able to name names. There was no kind of confusion of identity, and we could link right into the story to the letter, so there was no, there could be no mistaking that these people were cops who should not be cops. And one of the frustrating things about the story is we knew of all these other cases, many other officers who had done things, in some cases not worse than murder, obviously, but had very alarming records, and we knew who they were, and we knew where they worked, but we just didn't feel comfortable putting that in print. And if you have any thoughts on how we might go about this reporting, or any suggestions for how to make the coverage better, I would love to hear it. Please give me an email at khopkins@adn.com. Thank you so much.
I mean, he's supposed to be helping out, not. He's supposed to be helping, not furnishing and taking her life or her childhood. Who hired him? How come they let him work?